Hello everybody and welcome back to the Galactic Armory. Today I'm going to be showing you how you can make your own Galactic Armory helmet just like this one. Now I gave these 3D files away for free earlier this year, so a lot of you might have them, but if not, you can find them in the description or when you join the Patreon. I know it's going to sound like I'm just tooting my own horn, but I really love the design of this helmet, how the faceplate lifts up and lifts back down, and I also tried some new smoothing and weathering techniques that I'll show you guys later in the video. You can find links for everything in the description below, but let's go ahead and get started with the tutorial. Now, as with any 3D print, the first thing we need to do is smooth out all those 3D printer lines, and for something like this that is pretty geometrically simple, I like to use this Bondo fiberglass resin. Now I say geometrically simple in that this helmet, it doesn't have a lot of recessed areas or super detailed areas. It has long, open, swooping areas that will be easy to sand. Now this fiberglass resin comes as a two-part mixture, and then use the little dropper of a hardening solution and mix the two together. You only need a little bit of the hardening solution, otherwise it'll go too fast, but make sure not to use too little, otherwise it will not cure and harden at all. I'll just use a little 1-inch brush to brush this resin all over the helmet, making sure to wear gloves and a respirator while doing this. But you want to try and cover as much of the helmet as possible, making sure that there are no high spots or like runs in the resin. You want to try and level it out as best you can. I try to avoid putting too much resin on some of those detail areas around the face T-visor opening, since this resin, once it's hardened, is very hard and very difficult to sand by hand if you need to, so we want to preserve those detail areas as best as we can. We're going to wait a few hours for this resin to harden, but then we should be able to start sanding. Okay, like I said earlier, this resin is very hard when it finishes curing, so we're going to use some power tools to sand this thing down. So with me I've got my mouse-powered sander, and on it I have some 60 grit sandpaper, something really coarse. You're going to need something rough to sand and smooth out this resin. While sanding everything out, you want to be careful not to go through the resin and start hitting the plastic underneath. We only want to be smoothing out the resin, and theoretically the 3D print below should not be touched. We're sanding the resin, not the plastic, because this 60 grit sandpaper will eat through the plastic very quickly. You are also going to want to wear a respirator for this part because it's going to kick up a lot of dust, a lot of fiberglass stuff, and honestly, if you're not wearing a PPE suit, you should take a shower or something afterwards. That's what I did because I was also covered in this fiberglass dust, and obviously that's something you don't want. So here's that new product I mentioned. It is the Dupli-Color filler primer. I typically use Rust-Oleum filler primer, but I've heard a lot of good things about this product, so I wanted to give it a try. Before I review it, this filler primer is going to do a great job at filling in a lot of these small scratches and indents that the mouse sander left behind. The mouse sander is kind of a hammer when it comes to sanding. You are just going over everything. It takes a lot of material off, but also leaves your helmet kind of rough. So this stuff is going to fill in a lot of those very, very tiny microscopic scratches, but then we'll be able to follow up and hand sand this helmet, and that should make everything smooth. Now, how does the Dupli-Color stack up against the Rust-Oleum? Well, for price, it was over twice as much. A single can of this Dupli-Color filler primer was about $10 compared to Rust-Oleum's about like $4. So out of the gate, you're already spending more money, but overall I found it to be worth it, and here's why. I felt that one coat of Dupli-Color filler primer equaled about 2 to 3 coats of the Rust-Oleum brand. I ended up using about the same amount of material to finish this helmet, but I saved a significant amount of time waiting in between coats. For example, normally if I'm using Rust-Oleum, I would do a single coat, wait about 20 minutes, do another coat, another 20 minutes, and then one more coat to finish it off. With this Dupli-Color filler primer, I put on one coat and felt like it was good out of the gate. I layered it a couple times just to see how well it would fill in. So although it's a bit more expensive, in my opinion, it's worth it because it saved me like an hour of time. And if that's something you would like to do, I definitely recommend this. I had to get it from an automotive store like O'Reilly's. It wasn't available where I usually get my Rust-Oleum filler and sandable, but it shouldn't be too hard to find. So now after doing a couple layers of the filler, I'm going to go in and touch up some of the parts that are still not smooth with some Bondo glazing and spot putty. Now for the filler, I would definitely recommend you either only use or you end on the gray colored filler, because the red color filler very closely matches Bondo, and it made Bondoing this thing a little bit more difficult than it needed to be. So keep that in mind going forward. But this Bondo glazing and spot putty is going to harden up over like the course of several hours. From there, we'll be able to sand it smooth with like a medium 220 grit sandpaper pad, but then the helmet should be smooth and ready for painting. So for the paint job, I'm going to be doing a couple different things that might not show up in video only because I filmed it, wasn't quite happy with it, so maybe I like redid it a different way, but the techniques are going to be the same. So for the paint job on the helmet, we're going to be starting with a gunmetal silver base. This is actually going to be part of the weathering techniques that we'll do later. I don't know exactly where I want to weather the helmet, so I'm just going to cover everything in a light layer of this gunmetal silver. So once our gunmetal silver coat has dried, we're going to be applying a little bit of liquid latex. Now this stuff is like a paintable rubber. You just brush it on the helmet where you want those gray parts to be poking through. It's going to cover up the gray paint. We're going to paint over it, but then we'll be able to peel off the latex, revealing the gray paint that should still be underneath. Now I'm applying it here with a paintbrush, but I found later on that the best tool to apply this for me was a toothpick because I could control the edges a little bit better when I was applying it with a paintbrush. Number one, it's going to ruin the paintbrush no matter what. But number two, I also couldn't get the edges very like pokey and splintery. They were more of just a blob of latex. And you want those edges to be kind of poked out and jagged instead of smooth to indicate the paint being chipped off through damage. That's what we're trying to emulate here, and I found a toothpick was an easy tool to do that with. This is one of those steps that I did and then didn't like and then redid, so the patterning might be a little bit different. I ended up just trying to as closely emulate the faceplate from my logo as I could, but we're going to be doing a bit of layering for this weathering job, which is a bit more involved. So once the latex has dried, we're going to be painting on the white for the base coat of the helmet. This is the color that the helmet is mostly going to be, so just be sure and take it slow in light coats, waiting about 20 minutes in between each coat. So now here is the latex weathering I was talking about. We're going to be putting some latex on top of the original latex that we put, while also expanding out the edges a little bit. We are only doing this under areas that we are then going to paint blue. So at the end, we'll have blue over latex, over white, over latex, over gray. It's a little bit tricky to explain, but once you guys see what I'm talking about, it should all make sense. We are essentially layering the paints and the latexes, gradually building outwards so we get a nice layering chipped paint effect. So now we're going to be taping off the helmet to prepare for the blue paint, and we want it to be as symmetrical as possible. I didn't film it, but I went ahead and traced out the pattern I wanted to tape with a pencil, just to save myself some time. But once we have those areas taped off, we're ready to add the blue. For the blue, I'm using a Rust-Oleum Brilliant Blue. I chose this color because it is acceptable as a color of the 501st Legion, and that's kind of what the logo was inspired by. Be sure and do light coats. This is a gloss paint, so I wanted to take it lighter and slower, and I put a few newspaper clippings to cover up the rest of the helmet so that I didn't have to use all that tape. So once our blue paint has dried, we can peel off the tape, and this helmet is really starting to come together. And now we can also start to peel off the liquid latex from the helmet, and you can kind of see what I'm going for. So underneath the blue paint is going to be our white, and then underneath that is going to be our gray. And because we expanded out the latex on each layer, we get this nice chipped layering effect, and I really like how it turned out. This is though one of those things that I redid just because I felt like I went a little bit too overboard on it the first time around. If I had any advice, it would be that less is more, and make sure that your latex edges are like jagged and pointed, not blobby like mine were. So one final thing I wanted to do for the latex weathering was a technique I saw by Art Wizard Creations on Instagram. He makes some great stuff, go check out his profile. But it's using this Tester's metallic silver and painting it on very lightly on top of the gray silver paint underneath. It really gives it that freshly cut metal look, and I really liked it, so I wanted to try it out on this helmet, and I think it came out pretty good. Theoretically, I should have some of the gray damaging across the faceplate, not just under the blue spots, but I was okay moving forward, and this really is just kind of a touch-up thing. You can get the vial on Amazon, but I barely used any of the paint really. I could probably make 100 helmets with this one tiny vial like this. But if you like the look, it'll be linked in the description. So now it's time to start weathering the rest of the helmet. First, I like to start with a black wash. It is some black acrylic paint mixed with just a little bit of water. And I'm going to be brushing it on over the helmet with a sponge brush. Now I like to cover the helmet in sections so this watery mixture of paint doesn't get away from me. But I'll brush it on and then dab it off with a paper towel. Now the nice thing about this technique is that it is pretty dynamic. You can either add a lot of black paint to your wash to have it be really dark, or just a little bit to just kind of dirty it up a little bit. You could also approach it by doing more layers. So you could do more layers of thin paint compared to a single layer of like a medium mixed paint, which is what I usually try to aim for. But I'll do this wash over the entire helmet, both the faceplate and the main body of the helmet. Although I already did the main body, I touched up a little bit around the T visor opening that I had painted in a light gray. Now the new weathering technique that I wanted to try was actually using some oil paints. I've never used oil paints to weather a helmet before, but I've always been curious to try, so I thought I'd do it on this one. I used it to touch up and darken the areas around the T visor opening to kind of give the impression that that metal was riveted on, and that's kind of where like rust and dirt start to accumulate, is between hard edges and where metal overlaps. So to try to give the impression of age, I darkened those spots up a little bit. I also darkened up a lot of these silver testers from earlier, just because I felt they were a little bit too shiny and it kind of distracted the eye. But you really should only use just a little bit of paint. I watched a lot of model plane weathering videos to help me with this. That's a great community, does some amazing work, but a lot of it also applies to helmet weathering. Now the faceplate is what I wanted to focus on. I figured that the faceplate would be getting the most damage of any part of this helmet because it is front facing, it'll face towards your hypothetical enemy, and it will also be down during any time of combat. So I wanted to really weather this thing down, make it look like it's protected its wearer from a lot of damage. I figured one part of that would be kind of wearing it out in the elements and exposing it to like rain, mud, dirt, all of that. And so I kind of wanted a look for the 3 vents on each side to give off the appearance that rain was kind of falling down them and trickling towards the center of the helmet. So I used the oil paints to kind of give off a dripping effect to try and kind of emulate rainwater runoff. The first time around, I think I went too far. I really focused on elongating those lines towards the center of the helmet on those vents because that's where water would naturally kind of flow to, but I think I went too far and it kind of distracted the eye again just based on how uniform they were. So I used some mineral water to clean off the oil paint, try it again, and for the final version I elongated the center runs a little bit more, but held myself back and didn't make them too long that it was distracting. I really like how this came out though. I don't know the vibe for it, but it's kind of like a rusted steampunk, and it just got me very excited to eventually one day make the full set of the Galactic Armorer armor that I had commissioned. This is the full set, and I plan to use this helmet as part of the costume, but the rest of the armor files haven't even been designed, and it's a long ways off, but might be a long-term goal for the channel. But I think doing the entire armor in this kind of rusted steampunk look would look just so cool. So I'm very excited to try this oil painting weathering techniques on more helmets and more props. We are almost done with the helmet, just a couple more things to add before it's finished. Number 1, I wanted a mesh behind the 3 vents on each side of the faceplate, so I brought out the mosquito head net again, cut out long strips of it. I wanted the netting to be pretty dark, so I layered it over itself 4 times before using a hot glue gun to glue it onto the interior of the faceplate. And number 2 is going to be the face shield inserts into the eye sockets. Now for a lot of my helmets lately, I've been adding in a ridge to hold these visors in place without the need for something like epoxy putty, while also including a template that you can use to cut out of a Hobart face shield so you have the exact right size the first time, and it just worked great for this helmet. I already had some cut out from a previous face shield, but they just slide right into the ridges, and the ridges hold them in place, and if the face shields ever get scratched or too dirty, you can easily pull them out and replace them with a new one, and I think it just worked great for this helmet. So there you go guys, that is how I made my own Galactic Armory helmet. It kind of felt like this was just me stroking my ego making my own logo, but I'm very pleased with how the helmet came out. I tried some new techniques, and overall I am very happy with how the helmet came out. And of course you can always apply some of these techniques to helmets that you want to make, so I hope you learned something as well. Links to everything used can be found in the description. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.